In this video, I'm going to talk about a whole load of additional distance sensor and rear case removal considerations that have come to light since I made the last video. Some of this has been a result of me doing this lots and lots of times because we've been developing a new distance sensor, and so I've done this on the car a whole load of times, and there have been a few things that have popped up that I haven't mentioned before. In addition to that, I've been helping loads of workshops and people around the globe to do their own work, which is fantastic that lots more people are getting into it, especially the DIYers. But some things have popped up that have happened to people that I then needed to talk them through to fix up what's going on, and I thought I'd make a video that mentions all of this stuff. When you are removing all the screws to remove the rear casing, we said there's all those around the perimeter, and this one here, it's the one that has the same sized Torx as all these others. It's not the one with the Allen key fitting just there. It's that one there. And obviously they all need to come out prior to pulling it off. Some people have accidentally removed this one here as well and gone, that's fine, I'll just leave that out. No, that must go back in. And the reason for that is the equivalent of the same screw but at the other end of the idler gear shaft, which is this one here. So we're removing that from there to allow that to come out. So if that screw there comes out, when you start moving off the rear casing, it'll want to start to move the that shaft a little bit further forward, and the thing will just jam in there terribly. You will not be able to get the rear casing off, and the only way that you will be able to successfully remove it is to somehow get this shaft back into the correct position and put that screw back in place so that's held in place. People have done that before by shining a light down here, getting a screwdriver or a pick tool and gradually moving this forward so they can then put this in place. But the big secret is to make sure that if you accidentally remove this one here, which is in part of the main casing, make sure it goes back in prior to trying to remove the rear casing. When removing the rear casing, obviously the casing has been removed at the moment, but before you start, I'm going to have those threaded bolts like I talked about previously in here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a nut on the end of that, and I'm going to have that out because the gap in here when it becomes free is 15 millimeters. So I'm going to have this at the end, so I have at least 15 millimeters, maybe a good inch or so, and that's to stop the casing from falling rearwards when it comes free. And then when it finally pops off and it does that, it's going to obviously not come further forward. But then to make everything safe to actually remove, this is what I'm going to do. I'm now just going to move each of these nuts a little bit further back, and then that now allows me to lift this whole thing up and put it back, and I look through the back here and align the shafts and just put that into place. So it's sitting on there like that, and then I can just run that forward, and now that's not going to move. And now it's very, very simple to remove the whole tool without this moving at all, because it's just being held by that single nut. And then once everything comes off, then you can move it rearwards under much more control without any weight at the rear, so you can find the pinion shaft bearing and that sort of thing. And now, once everything's off, this is now nice and light. You don't have the big weight on the back here. Now we can just take that off. And we can do this very under control and make sure that we find the pinion shaft bearing, make sure that doesn't fall off, etc. When you initially remove the rear casing, the top shaft has this washer on the top that'll just be jammed on there. It won't come off, but these are loose. It's very easy for this one here to be stuck back there and just not even know that it's supposed to be on the back there. So make sure you go and fish that out, because it would then be maybe easy for that to end up down the bottom there, and you install the casing with that in the bottom of it. And a couple of things, big piece of metal rattling around the back of your transmission, as well as this thing not being secured properly at the back. So obviously go and find that and fish it out if it's there. If you've shut down the car in park, then what's going to happen is most likely the shift rod 3, which is this one here, will be selected forward to select first gear, which is the standard practice for the transmission. Earlier model cars like the 987, 997, if they've got earlier software, they'll select reverse, so you don't have this problem. But for most cars, if you shut down in park, it will have selected first gear. If you shut down in neutral, all the gears are neutral, so this problem I'm going to describe just goes away completely. But here's the problem with that shift fork forward as it is at the moment. I can't get the distance sensor out. It's all locked in there because of this part of the shift fork. What I need to do is move that rearwards to the central position, and then the sensor will come out. The problem with that is, though, that in moving the shift rod rearwards, if I don't have all these gears here secured, because these are just on splines, that one's on a bearing, these are just on splines, and they can just move rearwards quite happily. And whilst this is a bit stiff because it's been sitting out of a car for years and there's no oil in it, when you've just removed the rear casing, there's oil everywhere, and all these components move very, very easily. So it's very easy to, when you select the central position, to pull it all the way back into third and push third gear back, and that can misalign the synchromesh, which lives down in here. I'll spin it around in a moment and show you exactly what's going on when that happens. But the way to stop this from happening is to make sure that you have something clamped in. I just use a hose clamp, so that's pushed hard against this gear, and then I pull on that so none of this can move. If I grab hold of the third gear here, it might move like a fraction of a millimeter, which is normal because it's just sitting on a bearing. But what's important is that if you're going to move this, that this is really tightly secured. You make sure you check all these prior to pulling that gear rearward, so we don't end up with this problem with the synchromesh. With the transmission spun around, when everything is fine, and this has got neutral selected at the moment, the synchromesh that we're talking about is this one here. I should be able to get a pick tool here, and that should be able to move about a millimeter or so, just back and forth, like that. That is normal. And what I should see, if everything is aligned correctly, is that these gears are fully forward. I've got a big spacer in here. There's no gap in here. And the gap between the selection slider, this one here, and the gear, and that and there, should be the same on both sides. And if I've removed the pipe clamp from the back and I allow that gears to come forward, you can see now that that will just come forward like that. And third gear can quite happily start to move. So it's very, very easy, if I haven't secured the gears at the back here, for everything to move forward. And now I can start to see how I can just start to spin these synchromesh components around, and it's very, very easy for these to get misaligned. And the problem is that the helical nature of the gears here, when this is pushed rearward, it naturally makes it want to turn. So as it pushes these things apart, and it naturally then wants to make things turn, which gets everything out of alignment. So let me simulate moving that slider forward from selecting a first gear, because we need to get it out of the way so we can remove the distance sensor, and I haven't secured the gears at the rear. So if I just grab hold of that shift right and pull it rearwards, you can see everything gets pulled a little bit further back. And this has actually gone too far. It's a bit difficult to see that. But now when we push it forward, these things have now been opened up in here. Oftentimes what also happens is and it's done it now, is the yellow plastic synchromesh strut. It gets pushed over too far, so when you push it back, it now ends up stuck over here as well. So we need to get all of that into place correctly prior to putting the transmission back together again. Rotate the gears around now. If you look at the synchromesh ring here, that outer one, because there's 3 of them inside, that outer one there should be locked to the hub here. It's now completely detached from this here because there are some tabs that lock into it, and it can rotate freely, which is obviously bad. We don't want that to happen. And the first thing we need to do to correct this problem is we need to get these yellow struts back in place. And to rotate it like this, because normally you'll have a big black plastic baffle that sits underneath here. You won't be able to remove that because there are other oil pipes that go back to the ATF sump, which we would have to remove to do that. So we're going to leave that in place. So you certainly have to be sort of coming in from here to get access to it. You'll need to rotate these. By rotating this, this will also rotate the pinion shaft, which is the output shaft, which goes to the rear wheel. So the rear wheels will need to not be locked, so you'll need to have the park brake off. So the electric park brake will need to be turned off, so this thing here can turn like you see there now. And then what we're going to do is go around to each one of these yellow struts with a screwdriver and push them back in. So generally the best way, and these sometimes are a bit finicky to get them right, that sometimes they just push straight in. No, that one's not going to do it. Sometimes you need to use 2 screwdrivers where you push the detent ball in, and then that pushes into place. They can be a bit finicky to get them right, but once that's in place like that, then you need to go around to all the other 3 and do the same thing. We have each of these struts in place. Now we're going to do the outer of the 3 synchromesh rings. If you look here on that ring, we've got lots of teeth here, but there are these gaps here that have no teeth on them. They align with these empty holes here. So all we're going to do is rotate that around like that. And once I do that, that'll just slot straight forward like that, which is great. That's exactly what we want to do. And what you'll see from here is there are, if you look inside here, and it's obviously super difficult with the camera, there are 3 rings. There's the outer one here, which we just touched. We've got the center one, which is actually this one here, and the one on the inside is just popped out there. So this one here, which is one on the inside, and the outer one are locked into the hub, and this one here is locked into the gear. So how do we fix this problem now? The first thing we need to do is make sure that that inner one is going all the way forward like that, because if it's not, then that's the thing that we need to align. And you can't see any of the tabs and anything. The only way to do that is by holding that one forward, the outer one. You can actually rotate this one here, and it will take the inner one with it until it's in a spot where you can put it in. And that will misalign this one. That's fine, but you need to get the inner one in first. And then on this side here, there is a hole for that tab there. So then what we're going to do is just rotate that back around like that. I'm just going to rotate that back a little bit further. And then once it's like that, you can see everything slots into place. And now everything is locked nicely. And now we're going to push those gears forward, put the hose clamp on the back, and then we can move that shift rod rearwards like that and check that everything is fine. I'm going to go in there with my pick tool, check that I've got that little bit of movement on both sides. This distance here is equal to that distance there. And then you know that everything is aligned correctly. And a final check at the back of the transmission with these shim washers at the back. You see at the gear here, there is an extra bit of spline that's sitting on here, which is exactly the width of the one that goes over the top of it like that. So it should look like that for install. If it's sitting back and it's looking like that, that means it's not far enough forward and there's a problem forward of this. So you need to make sure that's all forward and in the correct position prior to then putting on these washers and installing. Now I think on the 911, it's not like this. I think the end of that gear sits flush with that and it only has that single washer at the back. But obviously the things at the front here are the big ticket items to make sure that everything's aligned correctly. But to stop all that from happening in the first place, shut it down in neutral if you forget, and shut it down in park and it's in first, no problems, but make sure you put a clamp on here, check that this is super secure before you start moving these gears. When you install the distance sensor and you put the plug in, it's really important to have this wiring routed correctly. And the OEM plug comes with this piece of plastic tubing, which is only about 40 millimeters long. And that is designed to push the wire straight back. And then it goes through 2 right angle bends, one down that way, and then another one up into the sensor. And the reason for that is because this is where it's going into in the rear casing. So that bit there is going to slot straight into there and then go sideways and up into the sensor. So when you install it, make sure it's not down here like this so it doesn't get jammed, and especially on, because there are aftermarket sensors where you need to do a whole bunch of soldering in here. And a really critical part of this, so you don't end up with pinched wires or putting lots of pressure on this harness once it's installed, is to make sure that this comes straight out, and then it's got to have that nice flexible bend through here. So when you install the rear casing, it's not putting pressure on the harness. And when you install the rear casing, prior to pushing in from the rear. Make sure you come in here, you can get in here and look at that there, and you can actually see in here where it's actually going to go, and make sure it's not coming down here and going to get pinched, but it's up there like that, so it goes into that little spot where it's supposed to go correctly. In the rear casing, there is this small aluminium machine piece, which just sits on a dowel and slides into place. And what can happen is that can sometimes either be like that and get sort of jammed. It's really easy for that to get jammed in a funny spot rather than being seated nicely, or fall off completely, because that sits there on the idler gear shaft. That's where that bolt goes through that you remove to remove the rear casing. And I've had a few people where that has not been fully seated when that's gone on. In one case, it was just off a little bit like that, and it just jammed up on the way in and started to bend up a little bit. In another instance, it fell off completely and was jammed in here after install, and it was only during the calibration where it picked up and jammed up the shift fork where it stopped everything and didn't do any damage. So obviously that needs to be correctly in place. Suggestions for getting that in place: maybe just check it. You put a bit of grease on the inside, stick to here so it sort of sticks to the inside there, or maybe even use a little bit of red Loctite, put that in place. So that's just firmly there prior to install. At the back of the transmission with these washers, something that can also happen is the first of the two washers, that skinny one, can fall off the splines and be sitting there like that. And then when you try and install the rear casing, obviously that's just going to jam that up and you won't know what's going on. So make sure that when you are doing that final check prior to installing the rear casing, that's there like that. Maybe put a bit of oil on these so they sort of stick to each other nicely and everything's nicely in place prior to putting the casing on. This is a suggestion that came from someone that I found very helpful. With the bolts at the back here, when you're pulling the rear casing back on, the shafts through the bearing, instead of having to counter hold the ends of the bolts with another spanner, he suggested, and this works really, really well, just put a piece of steel here, a couple of clamps, and that will hold those together. Whilst you are turning this, these never move, so it saves you having twice the number of spanners. In addition to that, I'd mentioned it before, but I do this now on both the shafts, where I have a pair of vice grips as sort of a chain clamp here around this one. It doesn't really matter, as long as you've got something like this that's going to hold the piece of pipe that you're using to pull against the bearing in a race, so that doesn't twist, because as you turn these, this will naturally want to turn these washers. I put lots of grease in between these so they turn nice and easily, but this needs to not move. And then, as you can see, I've just got my marks on the nuts there at every 180 degrees. So all I need to do is then just turn it through 180 degrees at a time, and it pulls it in nice and evenly. When doing the calibration, I would advise always to do this top one here that I've highlighted, calibration without previous part replacement. I would advise not doing the calibration after part replacement. The distance sensor calibration is all done as part of that top one there. The calibration after part replacement, the bottom one, will do a whole bunch of additional stuff which often fails and often has a lot of difficulty getting your car back online again. So if you want some more information on that, I made a video devoted entirely to what's going on inside the calibrations. I'll put a link to that video in the description below. Once you've successfully completed the calibration, I'm always going to run through the gears in rolling test mode. You need to put it into rolling test mode because the stability management won't allow the speeds to increase and for you to go through the gears without doing this, because the front wheels will be not moving, the rear wheels will. So the way we do that is come down here to PSM, maintenance repairs, rolling test mode. And there's value here, we can click on that. There are a couple of different options. The one that I always use is the top one, which is where it'll just stay on until I turn it off later on. For a single axis roller, because this is rear-wheel drive, if you've got a four-wheel drive car, 911, then you might need to use this one down here. So I'm just going to select that and then click start. The moment I do that, it's put it into rolling test mode. I'll get a couple of errors on the MFD in the car saying there's a park brake failure and it's in rolling test mode. That's perfectly okay. And now what I can do is go and start the car. and run through all the gears. The way I'm going to do that first is I'm going to come back to transmission control, bring up actual values and input signals, general, and I'm going to bring up the distance sensor outputs. I'm also going to bring up all of the speeds as well. So I've got the engine speeds as well as the 2 input shaft speeds, just so I can have a look at those, check that they're all normal. And then what I'm going to do is start the car, and I'm going to go through reverse, neutral, then into drive and manual. And once it's first in manual, I'm going to put a stick on the throttle, just motor the seat forward. So it holds at about 2000 RPM, seems to work really nicely. And then I am going to have a look at all the indications along here, check that everything is good. And then I'm going to cycle a few seconds at a time in each gear through second all the way through to seventh. I'm going to obviously have the rear wheel area very clear. I'm not going to have the rear wheels on. They're going to be off, so there's not much weight spinning. It's just the axles and the brake disc spinning. Because it'll get pretty quick. It'll probably get up to, I've seen over 150 kilometers an hour whilst it's sitting on the lift, which is fine. But then you can go through, check all the distance sensor indications are fine, that it all runs fine, that there aren't any errors. You might want to do that a couple of times prior to taking it for a test drive. When you are going back down through the gears, I would suggest not downshifting because it will rev match and it'll just rev the car like crazy. I would just take my foot off or take that stick off the throttle, and it will just run back down through the gears very rapidly and everything will be fine. And then if you want to do it again, then just put the stick on 2000 RPM and then run through it again. But maybe do that once or twice, check that everything is all good, and then you can go and take the thing for a test drive. Once we've done that, we need to go and get it out of rolling test mode and clear the errors, because there'll be some in there that we need to get rid of. So again, what we're going to do, so I'll shut the car down, so bring it back to this page here, shut the engine down, and then turn the ignition back on, because we can't clear engine or transmission error codes with the engine running. Then we're going to come down here to PSM, go into maintenance repairs, rolling test mode, and then I'm going to come down here, F8, stop. That'll take it out of rolling test mode. I'm going to hit next and then just check again that it's out, is what I do. This value area here is now empty, so that's all good. And now I'm going to go and check all of the error codes. I'm going to do that for the engine, transmission, and the PSM. And that's exactly what I'm expecting each time. So I'm expecting that the PSM error has filtered through to the PDK, and the rolling test mode is activated. They're not active at the moment, which is exactly what I would expect, so I can clear those codes out. And once I've done that, we're good to go to put the car back together and go for a test drive. There are some people who believe that if you install a new distance sensor and it works without doing a calibration, then you shouldn't bother doing it. I completely disagree with that, and I'll explain to you why. In the process of developing our new distance sensor, one of the things that you're constantly doing is to find the transmission control unit limits of what it's looking for. We would tune a sensor differently and then use the previous calibration to see whether it would fail or not. And sometimes it would fail, but sometimes it would work perfectly okay. But unbeknown to the person inside the cabin when they're driving the car, the transmission itself is doing some really weird stuff. So I'll explain some of those things that should hopefully convince you why doing a calibration is really quite essential every time you put a new sensor in. One of the things that the calibration clearly looks for is the central position of each of the shift rods. and it wants to hold that really nice and accurately, and it should do that because of the spring detents, but it knows where that central position is, so it's not accidentally pushing a little bit up against the synchromesh, so it wants to hold that quite accurately. If you don't do a new calibration with a new sensor, the distance for the central position could be quite easily up to about a mil and a half difference. That's normally within the tolerances of different sensors, but the problem is that the TCU is constantly going to go back and try and centralize this up. So in one instance, whilst it was going and changing the gears, it was constantly going back to a single shift rod and trying to center it. Even though the shift rod was central, it thought it was wrong, so it was doing this over and over and over. You were completely ignorant of it inside the cabin. There were no codes or anything like that. It's just going, right, I think that's wrong, and I'm going to try and recenter it. And that is constantly pushing up against the synchromesh. And that would have done that, I mean, I saw it do it hundreds of times just in the space of minutes. You could just imagine what that's doing over the lifetime of a transmission. So that was one instance where it really needs to know where that central position is very, very accurately. That it does is when it does the calibration, it very accurately gets where that synchromesh first touch position is. And it's like when you're driving a manual gearbox, when you're moving the shift lever and you put that first bit of pressure on the synchromesh to get the gears coast speed prior to it engaging. The transmission control unit is very accurately getting that distance. So obviously, if you don't recalibrate your car, it's not getting that accurately, and I suspect that it would wear out the synchromesh much more rapidly. From all the testing that we had done, when a gear is selected and the distance sensor detects the distance via the magnet movement, it seems to be considered correctly engaged if it's no less than half a millimeter short of that distance that it got from the calibration. So for example, if the distance here was 7.5 millimeters, it worked out as long as it sees more than 7.0 millimeters, it says I'm happy with that, I consider that well engaged. And it could be up to a couple of millimeters long, out to 11 millimeters, but as long as it was not less than that half a millimeter short, that was good to go. The problem with that is, though, if I install a new distance sensor where the outputs are vastly different, and that could be quite happily the case, and I'll give you an example. Just say the new distance sensor in that same position, instead of saying 7.5 millimeters, it was giving a distance of 9 millimeters, which is perfectly within tolerances. What would happen then is if that gear was selected and it didn't select it correctly, so for example, it stopped short, and instead of looking for at least half a millimeter short of that 9 millimeters, so 8.5 millimeters, it might give one from that previous calibration that was perfectly within limits. So if it might show 7 millimeters or 7.5 millimeters, which is well short of full engagement, and the transmission control unit actually think that is fully engaged, so it would then apply clutch pressure. Now, what's going to happen normally is if it thinks that it's not engaged correctly, it's going to skip that gear, and that's when you get gear skip errors, and what it's going to do is just rapidly go through a whole bunch of the next gear to try and find one that it's happy with. So as you can imagine, if we don't do a calibration for the new sensor and those distances are significantly different, that sill protection for gear skipping could be completely removed for some of the gears because of the difference between the two sensors. On the subject of whether or not you need to remove the transmission from the car, you absolutely do not need to do that for either Boxer Cayman or the 911. I've made videos on all of those, and numerous people, DIYs and workshops, have used these procedures quite happily to change the distance sensor over. Some workshops might insist that they take the transmission out. There is just a lot more risk, a lot more work. You're changing more fluids than you need to. It's just absolutely not required. And here's a perfect example. Here's a bloke that I've been helping out recently, a gorgeous 991 Carrera S. That had a distance sensor problem. He was just in his shed on jack stands, lowered the transmission down, replaced it, no problems at all, and here it is driving out of his driveway the next day. Happy days.